Hi, this is Pierre-Louis from Lyon again. We studied in the last video how to use a tool, very important tool for interpreting the Bible, which are the literary genres. Identifying the literary genres is essential to understand what kind of text we are reading and how to interpret it. Today, we're gonna study the context of the New Testament, and I will give you some key elements to keep in mind, as much as we can remember them, so that you will be able to take the shoes of a first century reader of a New Testament document. It is so important to know what we will study today to be able to measure the distance between New Testament writers and ourselves. And this summer, when we'll get together in live session, we will do the same with the Old Testament. So the first question we'll try to answer today is what happened between the Old Testament and New Testament. You know that we very often talk about silence between the Old Testament and New Testament. It is not that true that everything was silent, and you will understand why in a few minutes. But to understand that, we have to remember some historical events that are essential to understand how and in which context Jesus Christ came and how the New Testament was written after him. So the dates to remember, as much as we can, are the followings. The first one is 333 BC, when Alexander the Great conquers Babylon. It is the end of the Persian period. It is the beginning of a new era called Hellenistic period. In 223 BC, just 10 years later, in the month of June, Alexander dies in Babylon, probably of typhoid fever. And immediately tensions appears, as you can guess, in a big empire. People want power and they will fight for it, and very soon wars begin. Alexander's main generals share the empire. I give you here a very simplified view of history at this time, but it will be enough to relate to the interpretation of the Bible. So, when Alexander's generals share the empire, the Antigonids get Asia Minor and later will conquer Macedonia. The Seleucids get the former Persian Empire, and the Lagids or Ptolemies are in control of Egypt. In the Levant, which include Palestine, they are the masters. If we take a glance at a map, it would show this some years after Alexander's death. As invaders, the Lagids in Egypt and in the Levant tolerate local customs like Jewish customs. In those times, there is a very important event for us as Bible interpreters, which is the translation of the Bible from Hebrew to Greek in Alexandria. The legends says that 70 or 72 scholars translated it from Hebrew to Greek independently with the exact same result, with the same exact words in Greek, showing that God inspired even the translation. But this is just a legend. A bit later, the Seleucids take the power in the Levant, and it's a turning point for Jews because Seleucids, more than Lagids, want to impose the Hellenistic culture by force, and that led to what we call the Maccabean revolt. And also, it led to the redaction of some parts of the book of Daniel, at least the apocalyptic part. You know what is apocalyptic literature now. And in the book of Daniel, you have chapters written in this genre. And those parts, at least, were written around 165 BC, and they talk about the crisis, the persecution that occurs under a Seleucid king called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Another date to remember is 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey enters Jerusalem. That is the beginning of the Roman period, and as you know, This is during this period that Jesus Christ, our Lord, incarnates. So now, what to know about Palestinian political history until the New Testament? In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquers Palestine on his way to Babylon. Samaria and Judea are then administered by a Greek administration, and it's not simply a military conquest, it is also a cultural conquest. The language, the Greek, becomes the new language for high-ranked people in politics, army, or administration. And we will read together a text that is in a deuterocanonical or Apocrypha book of the Bible, which is 1st Maccabees. We'll read the beginning of this book to really measure how efficient the cultural conquest was when the Greeks came into Palestine.
1st Maccabees, chapter 1. Alexander the Great. This history begins when Alexander the Great, son of Philip of Macedonia, marched from Macedonia and attacked Darius, king of Persia and Media. Alexander enlarged the Greek Empire by defeating Darius and seizing his throne. He fought many battles, captured fortified cities, and put the kings of the region to death. As he advanced to the ends of the earth, he plundered many nations, and when he had conquered the world, he became proud and arrogant. By building up a strong army, he dominated whole nations and their rulers, and forced everyone to pay him taxes. When Alexander had been emperor for 12 years, he fell ill and realized that he was about to die. He called together his generals, noblemen who had been brought up with him since his early childhood, and he divided his empire, giving a part to each of them. After his death, the generals took control, and each had himself crowned king of his own territory. The descendants of these kings ruled for many generations and brought a great deal of misery on the world. Antiochus Epiphanes and the renegade Jews. The wicked ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus III of Syria, was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals. Antiochus Epiphanes had been a hostage in Rome before he became king of Syria in the year 137. At that time there appeared in the land of Israel a group of traitorous Jews who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, "Let's come to terms with the Gentiles, for our refusal to associate with them has brought us nothing but trouble." This proposal appealed to many people, and some of them became so enthusiastic about it that they went to the king and received from him permission to follow Gentile customs. They built in Jerusalem a stadium like those in the Greek cities. They had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant, started associating with Gentiles, and did all sorts of other evil things.
After reading this text, you can understand that Alexander's conquest and the power of his successors was not only military occupation, but it consisted in what we call acculturation, which means the replacement of the culture of a country by the Greek culture. This Antiochus Epiphanes in 1st Maccabees was king from 175 to 164 BC. He changed the name of Jerusalem, which became Antioch, his name, of Jerusalem. Circumcision and Shabbat were forbidden, and also he raised a statue of Zeus in the Jerusalem temple, what the Bible calls the abomination of desolation. All those provocations from Antiochus Epiphanes provoked what is called the revolt of the Maccabees that began in 167 BC and lasted 35 years. In this war, Jews who refused acculturation fought against the Greeks who influenced the Jews, but also against the Jews who adopted the Greek customs. And finally, the Maccabees managed to get some autonomy, even independence at some times, until the Roman general Pompey get into the town in 63 BC. In the year 40 BC, Herod the Great becomes official king of Judea, and he becomes also a Roman citizen. He was a great builder, and he reorganized the temple, he erected the fortress Antonia, and he even built the town of Caesarea. It is in this context that Jesus of Nazareth is born, between 8 BC and 4 BC. And in 4 BC, Herod the Great dies, and the Roman Emperor Augustus splits the country in three. Samaria and Judea becomes an imperial district administered by a prefect. Prefect was the guy who was supposed to pilot the district, and the fifth pilot of the district was Ponce Pilate from 26 to 36. In 28 AD, we changed the era. Jesus begins his public ministry. In 30 AD, Jesus is crucified by men and raised from the dead by God. And in 50 AD, the first document of the New Testament was produced. Probably it was First Thessalonians, even if some people prefer to say that it is the letter to the Galatians. In 66 AD, the first Jewish-Roman war crushed by Roman generals Vespasian and Titus, and in 70 AD, it's the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. I forgot to mention that probably in 62 or in 64, the Apostle Paul was killed. All those dates are the historical background in which the New Testament was produced. Because all the events that are contemporary of the New Testament are important, but also the history just before, all this Greek influence is very important to understand the context in which the New Testament was produced. So what is now the culture of the New Testament? Christianity has its roots in two cultures, Judaism and Romanized Hellenism, which means the Judaism of the first century and a sort of mix between Roman culture and Greek culture, because Romans themselves were influenced by the Greek culture, the Greek philosophy, the Greek gods, the Greek mythology, etc. So it's a mix, and the New Testament came into existence through this mixed culture. The older document of the New Testament, which means the first that were written, are Paul's letters. It's very important to remember that Paul's letters were written long before the Gospels. When Paul dies in 62 or 64, it depends on the chronology you adopt, but any date you fix for his death, Paul, when he dies, never read a Gospel. He doesn't even know what it is. I mean, he never read a document as the one we have in our New Testament. Of course, Paul knows the Gospel, the good news, but he doesn't know the literary genre Gospel. So that we have to keep it in mind when we read Paul to not fall into a trap which could be called anachronism, because we would import into Paul's thinking our thinking that we got from the Gospels. Of course, Paul knew about Jesus. Of course, Paul has been taught about Jesus' life by Peter or James that he met personally. But still, when you look at the details of his letters, you don't find many details about Jesus' life. He doesn't use Jesus' life details to preach. A gospel is to preach from the details of what Jesus did. But Paul is not preaching this way. He's preaching the gospel from the meaning of what Jesus did, and especially Jesus Christ crucified. Also, in the culture of the New Testament, the language, Latin, at this time is not very spread. It is even considered as crude, and it is spoken in Italy and in the army. Within the Roman Empire, Christians took the opportunity of what we call Pax Romana, established through wars and repression by the Emperor Augustus, who was emperor at the time of Jesus' birth. The oikumene, what we call the oikumene, is the whole known world at this time. It is a vast territory which was in opposition to barbarians, and barbarians were the threat all around the empire, and soldiers would go to secure the frontiers or to fight against barbarians coming into the empire. This oikumene is situated all around the Mediterranean Sea. In the Roman Empire, There is a policy of integration and of relative tolerance, especially in the field of religion. People could choose the religion they wanted. They could worship the God they choose, as long as they accepted to sacrifice to the emperor. And in this big context of globalization, which already was the culture at this time, it's not a new thing, the world globalization, even if the world was a bit smaller than today, but this idea of globalization already existed on this earth. The New Testament was written in this context of globalization, and in this context we can see that there were Seleucids, like you can see in Luke chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, between 8 and 6 BC. According to Suetonius, a Roman historian, a census was organized, and that's why we think that Jesus was born in this period. A road and a maritime network very developed that Paul used for his travels participated in this globalization. In this context, you have also the Roman citizenship, which is a legal status whose beneficiary could enjoy the most freedom you could have at this time. They also had little tax and all sorts of privileges. And something very important that participates also to this culture is the generalized cult of the emperor. I told you just before, you could worship the god you want as long as you don't refuse to worship the emperor. Now I'd like to talk about the social organization of the Roman world. It is part of the culture of the Roman world. There were an hierarchy in the social order of the Roman world. From the most important to the least important, you had the patricians, who were called the fathers of the nation and were the only one who could become emperor. Just under, you had the senators, which is an hereditary aristocracy, and you had the equestrians, who were from a sort of financial aristocracy. Under the equestrians, you had the soldiers, and then the plebeians, who were free people but poor people, and it is maybe the vast majority of people we can find in the Roman Empire. And also you had a huge population made of slaves and free men who were former slaves but who became free for various reasons. Those slaves were often military prisoners, and through generations they could get their freedom and climb into the scale, the social scale. But as long as they were slaves, they were like items, living items that could become free at last through the procedure of manumission. What is important to know also is that some slaves could become rich, and even some slaves could have slaves themselves for themselves. They could buy slaves even if they were slaves themselves, but it was quite rare. Another notion that is important in the organization of the Roman world is the notion of familia. It's a Latin word for family, but it's a concept that is broader than the family as we know it today, because in the familia at this time was grouped everything that is subject to the power of the father of the family. So it's a large, broad notion, because in the familia there are many things that belongs by nature or by right to the power of the paterfamilias. It's important to understand this notion because it's related to the notion of slave also. And when you read Ephesians 5:20 to 6:9, for example, it's important to have this background in mind. In the Palestinian society, even more than anywhere, everything revolves around the family. The individual has no social importance if he's not attached to a family. You are son of someone, or you're nothing. You're ben someone, or you're bar someone. Ben, it's in Hebrew, bar in Aramaic. But if you're not ben or bar someone, you are nothing. The family itself counts only if it belongs to a tribe. Even if in the time of Jesus the dynamics of tribes have disappeared long ago and the country is not organized around tribes, but there is still this honor of finding your roots in a tribe of the scriptures. If you can say, I'm a part of Benjamin, you can be proud of it, or I'm part of former Manasseh. It's important because you can prove by this that you are from this land from a long time ago, and that you are from this tradition from a long time ago, and that you're a Jew from a long time ago. It's very important because this notion of honor is the main value of the culture of this time. So you can understand the scandal when a guy called Jesus comes and say, leave your nets, leave your family, leave everything that your ancestors have built and follow me now. You can understand why some people would disagree and would refuse, because it would be so shameful. And knowing this notion of honor linked with the family shed light on some parables of Jesus. For example, the parables of the two sons. When the first son asks for his inheritance to live in the world, for a Jew, it's unthinkable that the father accepts that. Also, it shed light to understand why some people refuse to come to the big dinner, the banquet that is organized by God in his parable. And this is all linked with the culture, the social organization of the Roman and the Palestinian world at this time. And Jesus used this background to make people think about themselves, to make people react, to make people be shocked through his parables and his teaching. After the social organization of the Roman world, we'll have a look on the religious market in the first century. The religions by the time were so numerous that it is not possible to make a list, but there are big trends that are good to know to understand how the New Testament is reacting against or using the religious culture of this time to preach the gospel. The first thing to consider is the imperial worship established in 27 BC by Augustus the Emperor. Jews were exempt of it, as they were exempted from the military service, since Julius Caesar, who was not an emperor but reigned between 48 and 44 BC. Along with the imperial worship, Roman people would worship the Lares and Penetes in what we call the Religio Domestica, means the religion of the house, because those Lares and Penetes were semi-divinities of the household. They were wooden dolls, mobile and transmitted from generation to generation, protecting material goods and places. Long before the first century, the Lares were the genius of a place. It was the god protecting the territorial location of the family group, and it was fixed at a precise point on the ground and could not move from it. The Penates were the god of the country, of which they were the protectors. But in the first century, Lares and Penates were kind of household gods, and it has lost the first signification it had at the beginning. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you can remember that there is a scenery when Maximus, the hero, is missing home and he's praying his Lares and Penates. And I will show you an extract of the movie. So here he's praying, and you see the Lares and Penates. But in the movie, they replaced the Lares and Penates by a wooden statue of his wife and his boy. So they changed a bit the signification of what would a normal Roman citizen or a normal Roman soldier do when he was in campaign. Also, in the first century, each city has its own divinity. The main temples of the town would be for the main divinities of the city, but you could find lots of statues and altars everywhere in the town, like in Act 17 when Paul is in Athens and is waiting for Silas and Timothy. And the text of Act 17 says that Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, you see how Paul is using the culture of his day to preach the gospel. He's using the religious sensitivity of the people to give an access to Jesus, even if we know the story in Athens, he had not many success. In the temples in the city were celebrated religious activities following a specific calendar, like sacrifices, but not only. Sometimes you could even have games organized in connection with the religious calendar. So you see, the impact on the social activity of the town was very important from the religious background, the religious activities that were proposed to the people in some places. And in the big cities, it could be very important. Something to know also is that many people would live their entire life in the same place and would not even know what happened in the next city, 50 or 100 kilometers away. So the religious calendar had a very important impact on their lives. Mainly, what we have to remember is that the goal of Roman religion is to get approval from the gods. That's the main philosophy behind the Roman religion. But the approval of the gods did not depend on the behavior as we could think of religion today, but it was depending on an accurate observance of religious rituals. You're a good worshipper if you respect the rituals, not if your life is exemplary, if you're faithful to your friends, to your wife, if you raise your kids in a good manner. That has no importance as long as you're searching for the approval of the gods. So, the Roman religion is based on a trade. The worshipper could make vows to get a favor from the god. The god gives something, I give you something else. Or I give you something, and then you protect me. That is the trade between the god or the gods and the worshipper. And that is the background of any kind of worship. You can worship any god. The principle is quite always the same. There is another kind of religion by the time, which is called mystery religion. Those religions were many and centered on the individual that had to be initiated in a mysterious knowledge. Those religions were probably a root of what will become from the 2nd century a threat to Christianity that we call Gnosticism. There is another question that we have to take into account, which is the conception of afterlife of the people by the time. There were 3 general trends that are not in tune with what Christianity will propose later. In the Old Testament, you had this thinking of Sheol, which is an underground world where people are waiting maybe for eternity in peace, in a place of rest. In the Greek religion, very often it was thought about a celestial world where people could join the stars when they are dead. Or some people would think of no life after death at all, because immortality and power were the 2 characteristics of the gods and only of the gods. In some religious systems, sometimes people could expect to join the gods by their life or by their philosophy or by the rituals they respected from the beginning to the end of their life, etc. And there could be some expectations, some hope sometimes. But generally, you would think in one of those 3 general trends. Resurrection sometime was expected, but it was not a resurrection as Christianity will preach after Jesus, but some kind of regeneration as the cycles of nature, like spring coming after winter, then you could have another life. It's more of a reincarnation that was thought about until you reach the celestial world. So you could have lots of different kind of systems, but very often it was not the way Christianity will think later. And Christianity was a real revolution in the way it gives a hope for afterlife. It was a real revolution for a lot of things, but especially in this field. Now, a last field we have to study is the influence of philosophy on the first century thinking. This is very important because philosophy will have an influence also on Christianity after the New Testament. And even for New Testament writers, we can find some philosophical influences. And I will talk briefly about that. So, philosophy was only for educated men. A few people used to practice philosophy, as philosophy was not simply an intellectual field in which we were thinking, even if reasoning is the main base for philosophy. So you have to use your brain to think and to reason and to analyze the world you live in, but also to practice the ideas you had from your thinking. And it's an integrated way of thinking and living. If you want to know more about philosophy, you can buy books about the history of philosophy, for example. That's quite interesting. But the main trends in the first century that will help us to understand the background of the New Testament were first what we call Epicureanism, which is a search for ataraxy, which means freedom and peace, on the contrary to anxiety. And you can reach that, as those philosophers would say, through self-control. Another trend is cynicism, where the goal is to find freedom, which is the state in which you have no need and no desire. It leads to a search for autarky, which means being autonomous for food, for thinking, for sexuality, for everything. And it leads to a refusal of conventions and even thinking poverty, because when you're poor, you realize that you don't need that much and you can be freed from needing things. The main philosopher of this trend is Diogenes, philosopher of the 4th century before Christ, who was living in a barrel. Another trend very important to understand the letters of Paul, and especially the letter to the Romans, is Stoicism. Stoicism tried to be in agreement with the world, which means that we cannot change the world, we can change only ourselves. But in Stoicism, you change by your own means, by your own strength. And it seems that Paul knew this trend quite well without accepting it, or accepting some of its theses, but not some others. And at least the way that we need to change ourselves could be a Paulinian conviction, but you can't change yourself only by your own strength. You need the intervention of God in your life, and especially through the cross of Jesus Christ. So this is a brief word about philosophy in the first century, very brief, but now we're gonna finish with what was Judaism before and what was Judaism after the 29th of August 70, because in this day the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. In 66 AD, Zealots rebelled against Jewish leaders that they accused of collusion with the Romans, and they were killing people everywhere in the country, especially Jewish collaborators with the Romans, Jewish tax collectors, or even Roman soldiers or other people representing the Roman occupation. And in 70 AD, the Roman general Titus comes with his army in Jerusalem and destroyed the town and the temple. This is one of the main dates you have to know, because there is a before and there is an after 70 AD. Before 70 AD, Flavius Joseph describes Judaism as split in 4 irises, which in Greek means school of thinking. So it was the trends in Judaism that we could meet in the first century before 70 AD. There were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And there were many transitory movements like the movement of John the Baptist that came into existence, had success, and maybe disappeared, or was so small that Joseph didn't take time to describe them. So we'll try now to understand what were those trends that we meet in the Gospels. The Sadducees were heirs of Zadok the priest, and they were running the temple as in charge of sacrifices and everything that happened in the temple. So they were maybe the most influential Jews, at least for the interaction with the Romans. The Pharisees means the separated one, those who are not like the others. Essenes means the pious one, and the Zealots are coming from the word zelos in Greek, which means jealous. This was the word Joseph used in his description. They had different views about free will that you can see on this slide and about the end of the world and the afterlife. Like the Sadducees, they thought that there were no life after death. The Pharisees thought that the righteous would come back to life and that their souls would dwell into a new body, and that will be Jesus' position. The Essenes had a more philosophical approach about afterlife, and the Zealots were like the Pharisees. The different movements before 70 AD did not have the same understanding on the canon of scriptures, on what we could say what is a scripture. For the Sadducees, the 5 books of Moses, the 5 first books of the Bible we have, were the only inspired books of the Bible. And for the Pharisees, there were more scriptures, and the Essenes had a secret literature, and we find some in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like some books that were ruling their community. And the Zealots were like the Pharisees again. As for their social class, the Sadducees were up, and the Pharisees would be lower or middle class. Essenes would live in community, in towns, or in the countryside. They were seeking to be the pure people of God. The Zealots would perform a urban guerrilla, and they probably had in mind the revolt of the Maccabees that led to a form of independence when the Greeks were ruling the country, and so they probably thought that they could imitate what the Maccabees did so that it could lead to the same result. As for organization, the Sadducees, who were in charge of the temple, had lots of trade-off with the Romans to keep their power. The Pharisees were more close with the people, and so their elders were respected all around the country because they were running synagogues, and so they were more splitted around the country than the Sadducees, who were all around the temple. The Essenes were in community, and they proposed an ascetic lifestyle because they thought that wealth was a sin, and they thought also that celibacy was a sign of purity. And the Zealots expected a theocracy, which means a government established by God. What are the common things of the 4 heresies? They all thought about a unique God, a unique temple in Jerusalem, the temple built by Herod the Great. They all thought about a unique promised land and a unique Torah. But for the details, you've seen that they were really divided. So there is a before and there is an after this date of 29th of August 70. After, the Zealots disappear in the destruction of Masada in the desert. Sadducees disappear with their temple. Pharisees get more influence on a ruined Judaism, so they will try to rebuild a Judaism after this date. And it will include the rejection of Christians from the synagogue, which was another problem they had. They had to rebuild Judaism, and facing the problems they had with the Romans, they also had an internal problem with those Jews proclaiming that Jesus was the Messiah raised from the dead. And they had to take position, and they decided progressively from place to place to reject Christians from the synagogue. And this can be important to know, especially when you read the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John. Before the year 70, the focus of Judaism was on the temple and the sacrifices, the promised land, and an administration of kings and priests, even if kings and priests were not very important because of the Roman occupation, they were still there. After 70, the focus is more on individual practice of Judaism. It's less a community thing, it's less a people thing. It's more an individual relationship with God through the laws of the Torah, Shabbat, Kashrut, and circumcision. You're not a Jew because you sacrifice to the temple. You're a Jew because you respect the Shabbat and the Kashrut, which are the food laws of Moses, and the circumcision of your firstborn male. Of course, those three things were already there before, but they become the pillars of Judaism after 70. And we have no trace of any will to rebuild a temple after 70. So Judaism will move from sacrificing to reading and obeying the Torah. Synagogues will become even more important as the temple disappeared, and the tradition also will lead to what we call the Mishnah, which is an oral commentary of the Torah. The Mishnah was finished around the 3rd century after Christ, and the Talmud, which is of the 4th century, at least in Jerusalem, because there are different Talmud. You have the Talmud of Jerusalem that was finished in the 4th century, and the Talmud of Babylon, which was finished in the 5th century, and they are commentary on the Mishnah. So they are a commentary of the Torah. And through the process of establishing a new Judaism, a new form of Judaism that we call Rabbinic Judaism, Essenes, Baptists, and Christians were excluded from Judaism. And we have historical clues about that in the book of John and the book of Matthew also. But here are three examples from John where it is talked about being excluded from the synagogue, which probably relate to the persecution of the Christians by the Jews who rejected them from the synagogue. For example, in John 9, verse 22, it's about the blind guy. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him as the Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. So this story of the blind guy is a story of an interaction between Jesus and the Jews, but also it can relate to what the Jews were doing to Christians after 70, when they began to reject Christians from the synagogue. You have the same kind of example in John chapter 12, verse 42. Nevertheless, many did believe in him, even among the rulers. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, so that they would not be banned from the synagogue. For they loved human praise more than praise from God. And also it relates to Jesus and the Pharisees, but also to the Christians banned from the synagogue by the successors of Pharisees in the synagogues after 70. Remember that the book of John was written around 1995. And the same example in John 16, 1 and 2. I have told you these things to keep you from stumbling. They will ban you from the synagogues. In fact, a time is coming when anyone who kills you will think he is offering service to God. And again, that can relate to what Jesus said, to what Christians also were living with their so-called Jew brothers in the synagogue. You have to remember that the dating of the gospel, which is around 70. Mark was written in the few years before 70. The war already began between Jews and especially Zealots, and when Matthew, Luke, and John write their gospel, the destruction of the temple has already been done by the Romans. And it can also influence the way we understand some sentences, some verses, some passages of the Gospels. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, because this lesson was quite full of details. All those things you can find in dictionaries or commentaries, and that's very important to go to them to get the details so that your analysis will be more accurate. Thank you and see you soon.